what I find really interesting is that lately I've been reading a lot of astronomy and astrophotography content, and it's got me thinking, I've really been missing the idea of learning a new science or skill. And that's really what I've really enjoyed, is there's so much to learn about astronomy, and especially astrophotography, to even capture amazing shots, such as, even just doing a very basic shot of the moon like this one, or even doing Milky Way photography of capturing the Milky Way core, or even just capturing a nebula like the Orion Nebula here. What I found out about astronomy and astrophotography is that it can get kind of expensive. Unfortunately, it also gets kind of difficult to do. And so what I kind of hope to do with, I guess you could say, this new mini-series of astrophotography is to kind of help people learn a little bit more about the craft of actually capturing celestial objects and celestial night skies in a very simple and more affordable than having to have very expensive rigs like we have back there. So let's actually start with more of the basics, if you will. I guess this is going to be episode 1 of astrophotography, I suppose. Doing a very simple shot of the moon. So recently we had the Strawberry Moon in June, and I thought I'd actually start with how I got the shot first. So let's actually kind of go over the gear you're going to need to capture a shot like this in a very affordable way. All right, so let's first start with, I guess, the gear, if you will. What kind of gear are you going to need to capture amazing shots of the moon? You're going to need a full frame camera. The reason you want a full frame camera is because you're going to have better detail, I would say, than just, let's say, a crop camera or even a micro four thirds camera. But what's going to be important is how big of a megapixel count you have. Ideally, you want to get 24 or higher, right? And you could do this as well with a DSLR. I just happen to have my Nikon Z6 here. The next item, what you're going to need is actually the lens itself. You're not going to need anything super expensive. I actually would recommend just having a 70-200 if you can. This is kind of the go-to lens for a lot of different things. Capturing, super zoomed in shots, like let's say this 150-600. When you actually apply, let's say, a crop factor to a full frame lens like this, or even, let's say, a teleconverter, you could actually get some really good shots. So what you'll need is at least a lens that could go to 200 or above, ideally. The other thing you're actually going to need as well, I would say, is a really good tripod. You're going to need something fairly sturdy to essentially just keep your big rig set, and you don't have to necessarily worry about, the big lens moving around a lot. So in this case, if we're going to be using the 70-200 with my Nikon Z6, we just want to make sure that it's balanced properly, so every time that we take a photo, the moon or our subject isn't moving too much. Okay, so, and this is where this little Swiss foot actually comes in handy. And this is kind of why you want to have a steady surface for your camera, is because, well, the moon will be moving ever so slightly, and ideally in the next few steps you'll find out why, is that you kind of want to have multiple shots of the moon to kind of stack on each other. With that in mind, let's kind of go into the next step, if you will. Put this guy down. You're going to want to kind of get your camera settings right. And what I mean by that is that depending on the focal length of what lens you have, you'll need the shutter speed to be 1 over whatever the focal length is. So for example, if I'm using this guy right here, and I zoom all the way out to 600, I want the maximum shutter speed for this lens to be 1 over 600. As you go closer, let's say to 1 over 400, you could slow down that shutter speed a little bit. But the general rule of thumb for getting really sharp photos when you're working with telephoto lenses is that you at least want 1 over the maximum focal length of what you're using. So whatever focal length you're shooting at, you typically want to stay within that range. So you'll have to switch to manual settings to get that. The other thing that you do want to keep in mind is what kind of ISO we're going to be working with. One of the more varied limitations of the photo. So if we're going to be keeping, let's say, the focal length roughly whatever I mean the shutter speed roughly 1 over the focal length. The other thing you can mess with is the ISO. So with most night photography, astrophotography, you typically want to keep an ISO between 800 to 1600. The reason for that is that number could fluctuate a little bit, but the reason for that is because it's so dark outside, sometimes you may not see all the detail, especially if you have a fairly quick shutter speed, which we may be working with. And then what you'll also be wanting to find out is what is the sharpest your lens aperture could be, right? And depending on whatever lens you're using, so depending on what lens you're using, the sharpest the aperture could be will vary slightly. And there's a couple different charts that you could actually find online to see where your lens is the sharpest. Typically, what you'll notice with different things online, as well as different lenses, is whatever the widest aperture you could have, what you want to do is stop down at least 2 stops of light, maybe 3 to find that really sweet spot. So what do I mean by that? If this lens, not paired with a teleconverter or anything at 200, the sharpest or the highest aperture or the widest aperture that this lens could have is f2.8. What that means is that's as wide as it could go. Aperture for this lens is you're going to stop down at least 2 stops of light. So if it's an f2.8, you're going to stop down to f4, and that's 1 stop of light, and then another stop of light from there is going to be f8. So I would say, or f5.6. I've noticed that my lens is sharpest at f8. I would probably recommend, if you don't know what the sharpest focal aperture for your focal length is for your lens, I would say look online and see where you can find charts for what different people have tested. If not, the other recommendation is just test out where you notice the photos are sharpest for yourself. So if you have a 2.8 lens, or let's say even a prime lens, maybe just stop it down 2 steps of aperture just to see where it's at. So again, if you have, let's say, a 2.8, the sharpest is probably going to be f8. So what I'm actually going to keep my lens the sharpest at is probably f8, because I've noticed that's where the sharpest in my photos have been for this lens right here. You're going to mostly vary the shutter speed. And now what I would do is start practicing with getting your camera pretty steady at the moon and zoom in as much as you can. So in this case, I'm going to start out at f8, zoomed it at 200. Now what you're going to want to play with is the ISO. So that's where I would say 800 to 600. But the idea is that you want to get your images, one, as sharp as you can with the aperture, and stop down to that sweet spot. But you're also going to want to just get a consistent basis, because in the next few steps, you want the moon, the subject, not to be moving around a lot. So that's where the next step is take multiple shots of the same environment. And so with the moon, being zoomed in, you're going to notice a little bit of wobble. And this is where the shutter speed not varying too much is going to help you a lot. And so you kind of want to have a fairly bright image of the moon, but not too bright where it's blowing out and just being a white dot in your image. But you also don't want to get too dark where you're going to have fairly dark image as well. You'll play around with the shutter speed, the ISO, and the aperture to kind of get a good moon. And once you notice that it's not getting too dark or too light, what you might want to vary is that shutter speed mostly. But try to keep the ISO within, that 800 to 1600. If you really want to raise it to get a faster, shutter speed, be my guest, but you're going to get very noisy images. Then from there, you're going to try to keep that aperture at f8 or, whatever aperture is sharpest for your lens. But you're mostly going to be playing around with the shutter speed. And that's where, again, this tripod or a sturdy, tripod is going to help a lot. All right. And so this is where, once you've kind of dialed in your settings, you're going to take multiple shots of the moon and try to keep the subject, if you will, really whatever in center, as much in center as you can. Okay. All right. Once we have that, we're going to come over here and hop over to Lightroom. All right. Now that we have all our images, what you're going to want to do is actually open Photoshop. And what you're going to do is call the technique called stacking, if you will. So all you have to do is actually go over here and go to where it says scripts. And then what you're going to do is load into a stack. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to let you select quite a few images from your computer and actually stack them together. And the software in the background is actually going to be doing a lot of post-processing, if you will, to align up the images and create one imposed image by aligning the sharpest pixels together. So in my case, what I'm actually going to do is select these images right here. I'm going to delete this one. And so what I'm going to do is actually click OK from here. And then I'm going to, now that we have the 4 images that we want selected, let me actually remove that one real quick. What I'm actually going to do is hit OK. And what it's going to do is it's going to try to align the images and then try to pick out the sharpest pixels, if you will. Okay, and it looks like we have our moon fairly sharp from here. So what I'm actually going to do is go to File, and then for simplicity, I'm going to do Export As. Okay. We want to do PNG because that's going to actually, yeah, PNG is probably going to maintain the highest quality. And then we're going to export. From export, the important thing that we want to keep in mind is that we want to keep as much information about the image as possible. So once I have that exported, I'm going to come over here. We're going to go back to Lightroom, and we're actually going to finish editing this image in Lightroom. All right, now that we're in Lightroom, we're going to import that image. So I'm going to go to Import, and we named it Test Moon. So let's go here. Let's see if we can find our Test Moon. Yep, we just want to import this one. Let's import it. And there we go. Let's go to Develop. All right, so since it was originally a little more of a red moon, we're gonna add a little bit of that red to it, just to get a little bit of a tinge to it. There we go. We're gonna let's actually crop it now. So I'm actually gonna crop it. And then kind of center this. Let's go there. And what we're gonna do as well is maybe just bump up the exposure a little bit. Let's actually bump it down. Bump up the contrast a bit. Let's actually play with the curve. Oops. Let's add a little bit of an S curve to it. There we go. A little less vibrance. We don't want it too red. And tone it down just a bit. I think that's good. Let's actually sharpen it just slightly, just a little bit, and then let's apply just a little bit of noise reduction. Not too much, just a little bit. I think that's looking good. Overall, I think this moon is looking pretty good. It's fairly sharp on its own already, and I think that the stacking of the image actually helped sharpen up this moon. So I think we're pretty good. I think we're gonna hit export and actually use this as our final result. Let's take a look at it. That looks pretty good. I think that's a fairly good first attempt of trying to capture a strawberry moon with just simple camera and really decent telephoto lens. I think that's really good because again, what I said is that the stacking technique actually helps, and it's actually one of the more common techniques when you're actually editing a lot of astrophotography. Stacking becomes one of your best friends, if you will. I think that kind of is a good way to end this video, really. I don't want to delve into too much detail and just keep it simple, but you know, if you're really into astrophotography and really enjoyed this like short tutorial of capturing the moon, you know, leave a like and subscribe, or leave any comments of, you know, if you really enjoyed, you know, kind of the basics of moon photography and astrophotography, and you're wanting to learn more, you know, hit a like, please subscribe. There's more content like this to come. And yeah, I think that's a good way to end the video here. Yeah, like I said, astrophotography series is starting to develop, as well as more travel content coming up soon. So just let me know if you guys, you know, what you guys want to see in this channel. And yeah, I'm excited to kind of get into more of the astrophotography and kind of share my creativity and the experience that I've learned along the way for this. So until next time, see ya.